dusty marketplace on the edge of a war-torn region, an old man named Hamid wandered among the traders. His clothes were worn, his beard white with age, and his eyes carried a gentle wisdom shaped by years of hardship. He wasn't a wealthy man. In fact, he lived in a humble mud brick home on the outskirts of the village. But what he lacked in riches, he made up for in compassion. On that sweltering afternoon, he stumbled upon a brutal sight. A young girl, no older than 12, shackled and trembling in the corner of a slave auction. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes void of hope. The trader barked, "She's useless, weak and silent, let her go for 10 coins. The crowd laughed. No one stepped forward. Hamid did. "I'll give you 8, he said quietly. The trader scoffed, but eventually took the coins, muttering, "She's not worth more anyway." Without a word, the old man gently untied her chains. "You're free now," he whispered, but the girl didn't run. She stared at him in disbelief, then followed him back to his home. Her name was Layla. Orphaned by war, sold into slavery by distant relatives, and beaten into silence. She hadn't spoken in months. Hamid never asked anything of her. He gave her food, space, and safety. Days passed, then weeks, and then, one morning, the silence broke. Layla spoke. "I want to help you," she said softly. From that day on, Layla began tending Hamid's tiny garden, mending his old clothes, and learning to read from the dusty books he kept in a wooden box. She began teaching local children under a tree near the village well, using the same words Hamid had taught her. Children who once had no future began to write their names and tell stories of hope. Years passed. Layla grew into a young woman known across the region, not as a slave, but as a teacher, a healer, and a voice for those who had none. She opened the first school in the village, with Hamid watching proudly from his wooden stool under the tree. The same villagers who once laughed at the useless slave girl now sent their children to her school, humbled by the power of kindness. One day, a rich merchant visited and offered Layla a fortune for her story. She smiled and said, "All I ever needed was one person to believe I was worth more than 8 coins." And in the heart of a broken village, an old man's quiet act had lit a Years after Layla had transformed the village with her school and healing, her story spread far beyond the dusty roads. People travelled from neighbouring towns just to hear her speak or receive medicine she made from herbs grown in Hamid's old garden. One day, news came that the king himself would be visiting nearby regions, not for politics, but to see the miracle teacher who had lifted an entire generation out of silence and darkness. The village buzzed with nervous excitement. Leaders scrambled to prepare food and gifts. But Layla stayed calm. She washed the school's chalkboard, cleaned every child's face, and laid out 2 stools under the tree, one for the king and one for Hamid. When the king finally arrived, in golden robes and with dozens of guards, he expected a palace, a council, maybe a feast. What he found instead was a quiet school under a tree, led by a woman with calm eyes and a worn book in her hands. The king sat, listened, watched as the children read and wrote their names proudly. One girl recited a poem, one Layla had written about freedom. Then Layla stood and addressed the king directly. Your Majesty, I was once bought for $8, a forgotten girl with no voice. But this man," she gestured to the frail, smiling Hamid beside her, "gave me freedom, not pity, a roof, not chains. And because he believed in me, now hundreds of children believe in themselves." The king, stunned, removed. "Let the council come here." The roots of change don't grow in gold halls. They grow under trees like this. And so the girl once sold for $8 became a national figure of hope, with her village becoming a symbol of healing. And Hamid? He never left his stool under the tree, but statues of him and Layla now stand at every new school across the land. Would you like a YouTube thumbnail idea for this part or the next chapter in Layla's journey? Layla's name had become legendary, etched into books, echoed in speeches, and spoken in every classroom across the country. From a girl once bought for $8, she had risen to become the National Minister of Education, reforming schools, building safe homes for orphans, and launching literacy programs that touched every corner of the nation. But then, one morning, she was gone. No one saw her leave. No letters, no public address, no goodbye. The government declared a search. Her school closed for the first time in 2 decades. Statues were draped in black cloth. Villagers lit candles under the tree where it all began. Some believed she had died quietly, wishing for peace after a life of service. Others believed she had gone on a spiritual journey into the mountains. Rumours flew, some wild, some desperate. But Hamid knew. Just days before she vanished, Layla had whispered to him, "It's time they learn to lead without me. If I stay, they'll depend on me forever. But if I leave, they might find the strength inside themselves." Years later, during a school renovation in a remote village miles from the capital, a group of students discovered a small locked box buried under an old floorboard. Inside was a letter written in Layla's unmistakable handwriting. "To the children who once needed me, I needed you more. You gave a broken girl purpose and turned her past into a light for others. But you never needed a hero. You were always your own. If you're reading this, teach someone who's forgotten their worth. Like Hamid once taught me, build with your hands, love with your heart, speak for the silent. That is how I live forever. Layla." The letter was copied and displayed in every school. Every student read it on their first day of class, and every year, on the day of her disappearance, students across the country gather under trees, sit on stools, and tell stories, not of a slave girl, but of a teacher who vanished quietly and left behind a nation forever changed. Would you like a visual thumbnail story, #real stories, heartwarming stories? It had been 15 years since Layla vanished. Her tree still stood. Her stool remained untouched. Her letter was read every year by students who never met her, yet called her Mama Layla. The school she founded had trained over 10,000 teachers, many of them orphans and street children she once mentored. Then one rainy morning, just after the school bell rang, a hooded figure appeared at the gates. Soaked in mud and silence, she didn't speak, but in her hands she carried a small wooden box, worn but carefully wrapped in a crimson cloth. The guard approached. The children watched. The woman raised her head. She was not Layla, but the resemblance in her eyes, calm, powerful, unafraid, sent chills through every teacher standing nearby. "I was told to bring this here," the stranger said. Inside the box was something no one expected. Layla's journal, the original one she'd written in while living with Hamid. There were notes, maps, and sketches of villages without schools. But the last pages held something even more astonishing. Detailed instructions to build a secret sanctuary school, hidden deep in the mountains where no one, not even the government, could interfere. The woman revealed her name, Alia. "I was the first child she rescued after leaving the city," Alia said. "She lived with us for years, building what she called the last school, a place for children of war zones, where silence was never punished. She taught us to read, fight for justice, and lead without fear. But when she got sick, she told me, 'Take this back when the country is ready to believe again.' Tears flowed freely that day. Teachers, journalists, government officials, everyone stood in silence. Layla had never truly disappeared. She had simply gone to where she was needed most, quietly, without applause, without legacy in mind." That evening, under the tree, Alia was given Layla's stool. But I am here to remind you that you are the legacy she left behind. Would you like to continue with a final chapter? Perhaps where a future leader is inspired by Layla's legacy. Since Layla first stepped into Hamid's humble home, she was now studied in classrooms, painted in murals, and quoted in parliaments. Her teachings had shaped schools in cities, villages, and refugee camps. But her greatest legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was alive in the hearts of the children she rescued. One of them, a quiet boy named Tariq, had once been found starving outside the last school in the mountains. Layla had taken him in, wrapped him in her scarf, and told him, "You don't need to roar to be powerful. Even silence can shake mountains if it carries truth." Tariq barely spoke for years, but he listened, and he remembered. He later became a teacher, then an author, then a youth leader known for rebuilding destroyed schools with only books, bricks, and hope. But when political unrest shook the nation once more, and corrupt leaders tried to strip education away from rural regions, Tariq stood up, and the world listened. He walked into Parliament holding Layla's old journal. He laid it on the table and said, "She didn't just give us literacy, she gave us dignity. If you erase her work, you erase a generation." That speech went viral. Thousands of youth poured into streets, chanting not for war, but for classrooms, not for revenge, but for restoration. When elections came, no one expected what would happen. Tariq, the boy once too scared to speak, won the vote by a landslide. At 31 years old, he became the youngest president in the nation's history. In his first address, he didn't stand on a grand stage. He sat under Layla's tree, placed her stool beside him, and said, "This isn't about power. It's about passing on what was once freely given: belief, education, and a place to dream." And then he whispered the same words Layla once did: "Teach someone who's forgotten their worth." And so, the story that began with a slave girl bought for $8 ended with a nation reborn. Would you like a cinematic thumbnail?